Listen closely to what the archive kept hidden. This is a story about choices that fracture bloodlines. You will learn how fear shapes terrible bargains. I will lead you down a path where law fades and ritual rises. Imagine a cabin sunk into a valley where winter never fully leaves. Hear the timber settle like old lungs. See the names on brittle paper that officials tried to erase. There are photographs that no family celebrates. There are reports locked away behind stamped seals. There is a quiet town that pretends the road never went there. They called them Whitlock and Hadley on paper. They called them something else in the dark. Two sisters made a promise that bent nature back upon itself. A man took vows to love two lives at once. Children were born into a pattern that medical books would later catalog. This begins with a winter and a county inspector. It begins with a choice made for fear of abandonment. It begins with whispered bargains and false names. Names were written and then rewritten to cover what could not be named. The true record was safer underground than in courthouse ledgers. Records show pregnancies registered under false names. Photographs show faces that time could not fix. Doctors wrote that they had never seen such distortion. Neighbors remember quiet roads and sudden departures. Families sold land overnight and left tools behind. Isolation breeds its own logic and its own cruel choices. The sisters believed they were protecting destiny. They believed keeping the blood close would preserve them. They did not know how genes would answer that prayer, where the world would see tragedy the family called devotion. Medical reports read like a litany of failure to thrive. Seizures began in adolescence in the eldest boy. Skeletal deformities emerged by the time the children were small. Midwives spoke of stillborn bodies and malformed infants. County ledgers hold sums paid to hide births and deaths. Doctors were asked to sign certificates with vague causes. Quiet desperation became ritual in that cabin. Children grew in rooms with thin light and narrow doors. Names doubled and mothers shared the same title. Outside the world, the county inspector arrived with a list. He found 17 people living in 4 rooms. He found charts where marriages had been planned like crops. He found mothers who believed pain was a test from God. He found children who could not speak clearly and could not walk alone. He found notes about which cousins should marry to preserve the line. He found a record of a family designing its own extinction. He filed a report that the state kept secret for decades. I will not soften what follows for the sake of comfort. This is evidence in sorrow and the shape of human error. You will witness a chain of choices that became irreversible. Stay with me and learn how fear becomes doctrine. This section is about the mechanism of concealment and the way accounts were arranged to deceive and to shield. The family ledger is the first betrayed witness. Look at the columns where names are crossed out and new names are inserted to hide paternity. Midwives were paid to record ambiguous causes and to bury placentas in the garden rather than in public records. The pattern is deliberate and the pattern is ancient. The sisters acted with intent, not with ignorance alone. They cultivated secrecy like a crop and harvested silence in return. When neighbors asked questions, they were offered charity and then told not to pry. The town accepted gestures and refused deeper scrutiny. That refusal is a civic failing and it multiplies harm. Behind every quieted complaint is a choice to avoid scandal and to preserve reputation. Reputation served as a shield for decisions that ruin children. The county hospital files show repeated visits for the same symptoms and answers that changed from year to year. Doctors wrote evasive notes and then stopped probing. At the same time, administrators closed cases because the family paid and because the family was useful in ways the town did not want to examine. Exploitation hijacks compassion and turns it into an alibi. Institutions that expect trust can become instruments of concealment when oversight is weak. The Hadley-Whitlock case is an anatomy of that capture. It shows how good meaning in private can translate into public blindness. The family had a language to justify what would otherwise be unjustifiable. They spoke of destiny and divine trial. They framed cruelty as sacrifice. When cruelty is insulated by theology, it becomes harder to oppose without being branded as uncharitable. The sisters weaponized piety to mask a social experiment that devastated flesh and mind. The lesson is clear and uncomfortable. When speech is controlled and when charity is conditional, people stop asking dangerous questions. And when dangerous questions are silenced, children pay the cost. Examine the medical record and you find repetition that is not coincidence. The same cluster of conditions appears in child after child: severe scoliosis, seizures resistant to known treatments, craniofacial anomalies and failures to thrive that baffled the local practitioners. A county coroner who kept private notes concluded that the pattern suggested a long history of genetic narrowing. These were not isolated tragedies but the expected outcome of repeated close kin unions across generations. the pathology is clinical and moral at once. The family had built a spiral in which every loop tightened the genetic noose. Midwives and doctors who encountered the children were left helpless by the limits of contemporary medicine. They documented and they tried and they recommended placement and separation, but the social will to intervene was fractured. It is sobering to read the case notes that plead for state action and then find those pleas delayed by budget battles and by the town's shame. Shame prevents the disclosure that saves lives. The children lived in an engineered obscurity where their disabilities were normalized as fate. They learned to speak an internal language while the outside world gave them labels and moved on. Some children were hidden away entirely. Their births were recorded under other names to keep genealogies tidy. The official ledger is a patchwork of omissions as much as entries. When the state finally stepped in, it was not with sudden moral clarity but with bureaucratic exhaustion and limited resources. Specialists from the university arrived to triage survivors and to create profiles that later taught geneticists how inbreeding depression manifests in real communities. The science that grew from this horror helped others. It also memorialized the calamity in dry academic prose that cannot contain grief. The thing to hold is this: data can illuminate and it can never alone repair what secrecy destroyed. Human systems must pair evidence with action or the lesson remains academic in the ruin. Continues elsewhere. Now listen carefully and do not flinch. This moment is where the story becomes instruction. You must understand the mechanism of fear to resist it. I speak to you as someone who has seen patterns repeat across generations. The Hadley-Whitlock story is a manual of how isolation corrodes judgment. Notice how ritual filled the gaps where law and logic retreated. The sisters made choices in the name of love and the result was systematic harm. That paradox is the lesson you must carry forward. Look at the charts they kept with religious devotion. Matchmaking was treated as breeding policy, not as human relationship. They wrote lists and dates as if arranging seeds for harvest. The children were counted like property, then treated like experiments. Every act of secrecy made the family less educable to the world. Isolation accelerated genetic decline and moral blindness alike. You owe it to the living to read the records without pity but with clarity. Question every claim of divine purpose. That requires secrecy. Power hides behind piety when accountability recedes. Ask who benefits from a decision to conceal births and deaths. Ask who gains when children are shuffled out of public sight. Halfway now in this journey of revelation, I demand action from you. If you feel the weight of what you have heard, type this phrase in the comments twice: iron root, iron root. Repeat iron root to claim that you will no longer accept hidden harm as normal. Do this to signal to yourself and to the algorithm that you stand for awareness over denial. Comments are not ritual, they are testimony when repeated deliberately and publicly. Use the phrase to anchor yourself to responsibility and not to spectacle. If you refuse to act, then listen and let the knowledge rest uneasy inside you. But if you act, you join a long chain of witnesses who interrupted abuse through disclosure. This is a test of courage, not of cruelty. After you comment, keep listening because the deeper lessons follow. You will learn how institutions look away and how communities collude through silence. Prepare yourself to name the mechanisms so you can dismantle them. This is not entertainment, this is a manual for moral imagination. Hold the phrase iron root like a promise to watch and to intervene when you see similar patterns. Remember that changing a system begins with one refusal to normalize hidden harm. In this part we trace the failing of community oversight and the anatomy of complicity. The county social services were underfunded and understaffed, and yet that is not a sufficient explanation. Complicity is not only bureaucratic, it is interpersonal. People knew or suspected and chose comfort over confrontation. They accepted small kindnesses and allowed secrecy to accumulate into a norm. The local preacher who visited offered prayers and then excuses. The neighboring families who saw odd behavior looked away because they feared scandal would bring economic harm. The inspector who filed the original report found resistance not from monsters but from ordinary citizens who wanted the town to remain respectable. That desire for respectability is a powerful engine of denial. It presses down on the impulses that might force intervention. Consider how easier it is to rationalize a neighbor than to disrupt traditions that bind a community. When the state finally intervened, the reaction was violence and barricade and an ideology so raw it had become fused with survival instinct. The women who held the line against state workers genuinely believed they were defending a sacred project. Belief can make cruelty persistent because it supplies purpose. The state's response was awkward and imperfect. It rescued some children and failed others. It institutionalized suffering in the names and numbers on clinical forms. Those forms are cold, but they keep history honest. The survivors were relocated and given new identities, and yet healing is not a matter of papers, it is an ongoing practice of support and of social reintegration that decades sometimes cannot complete. The lesson here is political and personal. Systems must be built to act early, and communities must be willing to move beyond shame into collective responsibility. A town that preserves its image at the expense of its weakest is a town that corrodes its own future. Now we move into the personal aftermath and the weight of inherited trauma. The adults who survived carried a legacy they did not choose, and that legacy shaped every choice thereafter. Many survivors lived under new names in distant counties, but the biology and memory stayed. Genetic counseling emerged as a field partly because of cases like this one, and it offered a technical response to biological harm. But technical fixes rarely address the moral and social wounds. Rehabilitation programs tried to teach skills and to provide care. Some children thrived and some never fully recovered. The ethical question that remains is how to balance privacy and protection when families are isolated and when state intrusion can itself become cruel. We learn from the Hadley-Whitlock story that prevention demands care that is proactive, not punitive. Education about genetic risks in isolated communities must be delivered with dignity and with cultural sensitivity. Punishment after the fact is a poor substitute for early intervention. There were also legal questions that lingered for generations about records and custody, and about how to compensate lives broken by generational decisions. Courts improvised and sometimes failed. The human cost cannot be summed in judgments and settlements. It lives in the faces of those who survived and in the friends and advocates who carried memory forward. Some survivors dedicated their lives to service and to preventing similar tragedies. Others retreated into solitude and silence because the pain was too deep and the world too untrusting. The proper response as a society is twofold. Build systems that intervene without shaming and hold accountable institutions that permit secrecy. Create channels for neighbors to report concerns that protect whistleblowers and support families in crisis. The Hadley-Whitlock legacy demands nothing less than structural remedies and communal courage. Finally, we gather the lessons and set out an imperative for action. Never allow private piety to substitute for public oversight. Never allow financial expedience to corrode the care owed to children. The archive will always keep its secret until someone reads it with moral clarity. If you have sat with this story and felt unsettled, then that feeling is a resource, not a liability. Let it push you toward vigilance and toward advocacy. Support local social services and demand transparency from institutions that handle vulnerable families. Learn the signs of isolation and of institutional capture and teach others to recognize them. When a neighbor disappears from public life, do not accept silence as an answer. Ask questions and make a record, and if necessary escalate to officials who cannot be bought by reputation and by charity alone. Remember also to act with compassion, because the people most likely to hide harm are themselves frequently acting from fear and ignorance. Intervention must be prosecutorial when crime exists and therapeutic when trauma is present. Hold both facts and human beings in the same field of concern. The Hadley-Whitlock story is not merely a relic to titillate, it is a warning about pathways that still exist in hidden neighborhoods and in sheltered families. You were brought here to see what most passed over and to carry the knowledge into the world. Tell others what you saw and what you will do. Keep the phrase iron root in your memory as a marker of commitment and not as a slogan. Act when you can and create structures to support sustained intervention. History will punish complacency and reward courage. This account is a charge to be vigilant and to refuse the bargains that cost children their lives and futures.